In the year 3100 BC, there was no internet, but there was a dream. Grok accidentally left his weird triangle staff thing in a tablet of clay, and instantly, something was born inside of him. Before this, humans had used symbols for language even before they were humans, but Grok just then finally wrote something down. Something that could be transmitted between other people, long after Grok was ever even around. We have witnessed in this last century another revolution, similar to the one Grok stumbled into, except this time it was to a much, much wider extent.
All of human history is a progressively more stable Jenga tower of innovations, and writing is sort of like a bucket of glass cleaner, which allows you to clean off that grime from the lower windows and see through them. And at that same scale, the internet is sort of like a whole tsunami of glass cleaner, which basically just completely destroys every single bit of grime on those windows.
Language has had all this time to disseminate and develop, yet the web has just barely entered its golden years of 60 years of age. There's so many wrinkles, details, stories, communities, attitudes, and lives that were touched in one way or another by even just the beginning steps of this force that rules the world today. But together, let's venture back into a time before today's iApples and Microsoft Pros, into the era of pre-cringe.
Hey, come over here. I tricked you. This isn't actually a video about the internet because it wasn't even called the internet. So, you might hear some little words or phrases that sound vaguely familiar, but just know that all that stuff comes later. And for now, by now I mean 1957, all anybody cared about was the Russians launching this big metal ball into space.
Arms races were not unprecedented in history, but in this modern era, they were definitely surprising. Americans were built on their love of manifesting destiny, and now with nothing else to do, they decided playing with the Russians would be a fun way to waste time, but they definitely didn't expect them taking to the skies. This great sudden leap in technology sparked fear, anger, and action. Only a couple months later, ARPA would be formed. They were to take the US to space by expanding the frontiers of science. Until a couple months later, NASA was formed and sold much of their work and much of their talent. So instead, they were to fund high-risk, high-reward research for the next decade. They'd show just that, slowly chipping away at random scientific processes and at their past stated goals, until they were able to make leeway and define a new path forward.
Like a lot of these stories, it all began with nerds, specifically Donald Davies, Joseph Licklider, and the crew that supported them. Computer communications around this time were god-awful, specifically because of how phone lines and data were different. Something that packet switching could fix, which it essentially would just deliver them both the same set of data, which sped up a lot of procedures and actually took down the cost of resources.
By this point, ARPA was tired of getting shoved into the locker by NASA, decided to finally throw in the towel and focus on smaller research programs, or at least that's how they saw it, because in the same year, they also approved the production of ARPANET, the first web, which was made up of real computers and what you would call little energy-sucking imps, which would basically send code, encode, receive, and decipher all of the computer's thoughts, just from miles and miles away, at different speeds thought unthinkable for a time, a whopping 50 kilobytes every second.
And although it had been conceived of in 1965, it would still take 4 full years of development and 2 years after it had been electronically connected for them to actually be able to activate the system and use it. So after all this anticipation, they finally gathered together next to this cold 1960s computer monitor as Charlie Klein typed in L-O. And then the system crashed, so they all had to go run around for like a couple hours and change a few things, and then they finally all got back together. Then they finally typed L, meaning the first 3 letters in the precursor of the internet was L-O-L.
Slowly, this 3-computer setup would grow and grow into the hundreds across the Atlantic and eventually in space. But remember, ARPA, now with a D, was only some lowly researching firm, so they'd hand off control to the DoD and ran off to play Dungeons and Dragons 8 years. And now the government was only interested in discoveries that could be used directly in war, which actually instead boosted commercial PCs and likely helped what ARPANET would later become.
The Americans and DARPA weren't the only ones making these webs or these nets, and you could say it's even too many. And they tried to connect all these disparate random webs together. creating a term known as internetworking, which, yeah, maybe look.
Clearly, these new advancements were already trickling down to the commoners. As the military played around with their tools, internetworking, 3 separate webs, college students and bored computer nerds were hard at work creating efforts of their dreams. Bulletin board systems came up first, created by 2 bored guys looking for something to do during a blizzard. With spare computers and spare time, they conceived of the CBBS, which used modems to dial up specific system operators' rooms, and very quickly this power got into people's heads. 1 year after, 2 other bored college students would utilize newly released software to manually communicate news to nearby university students. Eventually, the hosts of these connections would start linking themselves together, resulting in the UCCPnet, or Usenet.
These were the major players forming the pre-internet culture. Their stories are also, to me, both very funny and very scary, and very, very funny. History definitely repeats itself, and as I said in the beginning, a lot of this might sound familiar, and later has now come. BBSs and Usenets essentially formed the backbone of pre-cringe internet culture, and in my research looks something like this.
12-year-old flamers, mainly encountered on the easier-to-access Usenet. The 12-year-old flamers acted essentially like every other kid using the internet today. Destroy them all. Edginess, flame wars, petty arguments, nothing was above them, and they tended to be lower on the caste system despite making up the majority of the traffic. Directly across and opposed are the system operators, or sysops. These were the owners of different bulletin board systems and essentially prehistoric Reddit moderators. They would put their own energy to use in tech online to keep up their very important and strategically maintained board, and you will respect the rules following it. Please, no off-topic discussions. I don't like you. You must go to the roach pit. They could just be normal people that fell for get-rich-quick schemes, or they could be nerds. Right next to sysops, the nerds share that same stuffiness and knowledge on the internet workings of their webs, yet also share the rage of the flamers, getting very, very far into their endless arguments over menial topics, such as the new Star Trek movie that came out called Wrath of Khan, where basically one guy dies and it's like this other guy.
Hey! Spock dies from radiation poisoning.
Or maybe they have a darker side of hacking and anarchy. They have some odd ideas about certain people that committed atrocities years later. Or they could be ANSI artists. On the other side of the chart, right next to the flamers, they would utilize technology very similar to ASCII art to decorate sections of their webs. This might seem like an odd thing to specify, but this ANSI art shit gets serious. Be prepared to be committed to it. There formed whole groups of artists which would publish whole new pieces monthly, and there was actually a ton of drama and controversy around stuff like plagiarism, so they were basically your prototypical Twitter artist.
These 4 main groups, along with federal agents, made up nearly everyone in the crowd at this time. And that crowd was getting to be gigantic, and their wallets were starting to be seen as a very promising promise. With an audience so large, many high-profile BBSs needed to become paid services to support the loads, because they were just normal people with normal loads, and to operate just one, you needed a full
Modem, dumbass.
This small nitpick of monetization would eventually drive a wedge between the massive ivory tower bureaucratic BBS owners and the simple plebeians like you and I. And not too soon afterwards, a lawsuit would be carried out which would not only spell the end for its propagators, but also the victory for everything that they hated.
Bulletin board systems and Usenets wouldn't sharply decline until the mid to late 90s, although these old chasms that began to eat away at them started to take hold almost a decade before, in 1988, when a myriad of different events began to challenge their jurisdiction. First, simple IRC chats, which were developed out of a program used for BBS system itself. Although these were more threatening to Usenets than BBSs, they undoubtedly took more users from both.
The second biggest blow would come when System Enhancement Associates, or C, would file a lawsuit against Phil Katz. Basically, they made this great compression software named ARC, and while it was shareware and the code was freely distributed, it was expected that you would sort of donate or buy it or pay for it in some way to just support the people who made it. But instead, Phil Katz saw this and he sort of improved it in a couple ways. He optimized it for speed, and C did not really like this very much. Although there is an understandable arc to both sides, while it is their property, Phil Katz maybe had a little bit of leeway in making it, an absolute fury was unleashed on C. Most wanted to believe that this gigantic meteoric company was going after the small guy and punishing this simple programmer, which bettered their programming, going against everything that PBSs stand for. You know, they call it the corporate, greedy, bland, and unoriginal, which is something they later call this fledgling connection of programs called the internet.
What we now know as the most used invention in history was also the third sucker punch to the old order of the net, and of course, it began where everything else did, with nerds. Tim Berners-Lee, being a bored college student at CERN, wanted to develop not just an inter-network net, but instead something that you might call an omni-network. All webs everywhere at all times, inter-networked into the ultimate superhighway of information. The real draw of this early version would be the code that it was worked in, which was incredibly sturdy and could support forums, pages, images, and embed practically every form of media possible, all with an ease of use thought unthinkable with the old order of the web. Although it wouldn't immediately consume all of its competitors, it took multiple years of development, slowly giving access more and more until in 1994, the code to create websites became totally royalty-free and very, very used. While it was beginning its run into the sky, the old order looked at it with a large heap of apprehension, some thinking it was cool, others hating it, and more found it poor and gimmicky, lacking the spirit of bulletin boards, thinking it was just some empty fad that was passed over, though maybe it should have been clear to them that they were staring into a mirror the entire time. Bulletin boards and Usenets didn't fully collapse until 1997, when a sharp sudden decline shook their entire industry. At first, this welcomed many of these unsavory people that came before, though they'd realized that all the money was gone, so they had nothing to stay for. And now today, with 900 boards still active, it's obvious that only those who truly love the tech and the community remain today. Usenets went down a much, much less wholesome route, basically being taken over by that same type of person. Many were litigated by law enforcement under the charges of certain child, adultish content, though their former glory is still shining through, with many archives still active today. I've said it before, but many loyal to the BBS style initially viewed it as the fad that would slowly fade away, and while this might seem like some boneheaded statement today, it was clear that they were simply wishfully thinking. Their experiences, their love for the community that surrounded them, the stories that dealt entertainment. They were simply people who wanted to talk to others, people they wouldn't even ever meet in any other circumstances, which clearly meant a lot to them. It kind of makes me ask, how are we going to feel when all of this gets taken over by some alien force of greater convenience? Honestly, it actually gives me comfort, because through all of our differences, birth years, circumstances, whatever, it's proof to me that all of us feel this at least once.
On the next episode of Internet History Stuff, we'll oversee not the beginning of the web, but instead its exodus out of the world, how it changed itself, how it changed us, and how it might change the world. We'll witness the creation of cringe, of most sites that we use today, and stock market bubbles. The old titans have fallen so that new titans can rise, which will only lead for failure for the wicked and success for the successful. And this all happened in the year, 1999-ish, something like that. I don't know. You'll see.